more you'll learn. I'm ready for the first slide, Mr. AV. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Speck. I'm starting. Thank you all for coming. This is an unusual event at CNU because it's one of just a couple events that are open to the general public, not just for CNU members. May I see a show of hands? Who is here who's just dropped in and who is not a member of CNU? Okay, who is a member of CNU? Who is a longtime member of CNU? Okay, why are you here? No, just kidding. Who came to my 101 yesterday? Okay, you guys don't need to be here, although I hate to have you go. The difference between my talk today and my talk yesterday is that this is 1 hour instead of 3, but also I'm illustrating it with Buffalo examples. But it's essentially the same talk. Now, of course, I don't know how many times you've heard that talk. I've heard it 100 times and I still enjoy it. So if you want to stick around and hear it, that's your business. But it will be similar to the talk yesterday. So I'm calling this towards a walkable Buffalo. Sometimes I call this talk towards a more walkable X, and sometimes I call it just towards a walkable X. And I'm afraid this one has to be just a walkable, because there is a long way to go. Another thing to say is that I will not spend any part of this talk complimenting Buffalo, because that's no use to you. And I'm leaving anyway, and you won't see me again. But my effort here is to be as helpful as I can and not to celebrate successes. And I'm sure there have been many. I know there have been many. Another caveat, I don't know Buffalo well. I don't know Buffalo at all. But thanks to the magic of the Google machine, I was able to learn a bit about it, enough to give some examples of the principles I'll be talking about today from Buffalo. Another thing is, if you're a longtime CNUer or you're just naturally good at this, a lot of what I'm going to be telling you, you might already know. And if you're hearing something you already know, I would encourage you not to think, oh, I already know this, but to think, is there a more effective way for me to present what I already know and already do? Because a big part of what I've learned in the past 5 years or so has been how to reframe this argument. As I mentioned this morning, talking about walkability as opposed to talking about new urbanism. And I tell every audience I visit that I'm a card-carrying, founding, charter member of the Congress for New Urbanism. But that gets a lot of blank stares sometimes. But when you talk about walkability, everybody gets it. So if you know some of the points I'm presenting, think about the strategies for presenting them. So I'm a city planner, which means I do plans for two kinds of places. I do plans for existing places like South Point, or I should say the South Beach in Miami, where I lived for a decade when I worked for Andres and Liz. I also do plans for new places like Kentlands, where I was the assistant town architect for a summer while I was still in school. I'm also, as I mentioned, a card-carrying member of the CNU, which means that we study these older places in order to make the rules that allow us to make these newer places. I should say we didn't study South Beach to do Kentlands. We studied Georgetown, and we studied Alexandria and Annapolis to do Kentlands. And of course, by we, I'm referring not to me, but to Andres and Liz and those people before us who made these places. But that the new urbanism is all about recognizing that the places that we love the most, that we cherish the most, that have the highest real estate value, that aren't necessarily in the realtors' databases because the houses just don't come up for sale, they're that good, that those are the models that we should be basing our new work on. I wrote this book with Andres and Liz back in 2000, and I mention that because it got me appointed to the National Endowment for the Arts, where I ran the design program. And I mention that because it allowed me to run this program, which kind of allowed me to, or taught me what I needed to know, I suppose, to change the argument to a walkability argument. Every 2 months, somewhere in America, the Mayor's Institute on City Design gathers up 8 mayors, 8 designers. We lock ourselves in a room. We try to solve every mayor brings their toughest city planning challenge. How do I reconnect to my waterfront? Where do I put my convention center? And we try to solve those problems, but of course in trying to solve those problems, we're actually trying to teach urban design to mayors, or more importantly, as intended by Joe Riley, now in his 10th term as mayor of South Carolina, when he created this program with the NEA, the idea is to send the mayors back to their cities as design mayors, who recognize that by hitching their wagon to the star of design, they can be much more impactful. And Mayor Riley tells them, he said, you know, if you balance the budget, no one's going to remember. But if you build a park, then you'll be famous forever. So this program allowed me to, hearing all these mayors talking about the success of their city, it became very clear that walkability was both the key, perhaps, indication to many of them. Street life was perhaps the best indication to many of them that their city was being successful. And also, it was viewed by mayors, and now I think it's viewed by most people, as a necessary part of creating a successful city. I've done a lot more work more recently for an organization called CEOs for Cities. You may know them. They're a nonprofit that cities pay a lot of money to come in and tell them how to be more successful, how to attract corporations, how to attract millennials. And they understand that it's a two-part deal, which is why they involve a designer like me. They understand that half of a successful city is the programming. What sort of sports facilities do we need? What sort of events like Art Prize in Grand Rapids that's really changed people's perception of downtown Grand Rapids? What sort of events like that do we need? But actually, that's only half the picture, and the other half is just the plain everyday life in the streets, between the buildings, and whether these spaces are designed in a way that's attracting people and creating that pedestrian culture. So we begin with this premise then that a vital place is full of pedestrians, which sometimes takes a little bit of convincing, but not very much. And then we ask, if a vital place is full of pedestrians, how do you get people to walk? And that's led many new urbanists and me to what I now call the General Theory of Walkability, which is built upon so much work that so many people here today have done. And what the General Theory of Walkability says is that in America, where driving is so easy, where driving is so cheap, where the car sits between you and everything else, in which every trip you take costs less than the trip before, because 4/5 of the cost of driving are owning the car, and only 1/5 are driving the car. And so it's smarter to drive, and particularly once you've got that car, you're going to drive it as much as you can. That's the smart economic thing to do. In that circumstance, how can you get people to walk? And the only way to do it is to provide a walk that's as good an experience as the drive. That means that and it's in my book. There'll be a book signing after this. I encourage you, as I said yesterday, I don't care if you buy my book, I just want you to read it. But I will be signing books after this talk over there. So the question is, how do you get people to walk? The answer is, you need to simultaneously do 4 things. The walk has to be useful, the walk has to be safe, the walk has to be comfortable, and the walk has to be interesting. And that's the structure of my talk today. So the reason to walk is the story that I first learned from Andres and Liz. It's the formative story of the planning profession, how the dark satanic mills were clouding the skies and shortening the lives of people in Europe and elsewhere in the 19th century, and how the planners actually made the decision, let's separate the housing from the mills, and the lifespans increased immediately. They increased dramatically, and we like to say that the planners have been trying to repeat that experience ever since, with the onset of Euclidean zoning and large areas of land dedicated to single use, which of course all you need to know when you look at a plan like this one, which is the typical plan that I encounter when I arrive at a city to do something different than this, is that no one will ever walk because each use is so large and so separated from each other use. Now, I was an art history major, which they say is a useless major, but I can say this is a Rothko, and what you want is a Syrah. Pointillism. Yay, art history majors. The most walkable places we have in our country are the most fine grain, the most confetti-like mix of uses. And this map of Manhattan is even misleading because the red color is vertically mixed use. So then here's the story that I first heard from Andres in 1987, and which subsequently became the backbone of the book Suburban Nation, which is that really when you're looking at creating new places, and this talk is almost entirely about our existing cities, but when you're looking at creating new places, there are really only two choices: the traditional neighborhood and suburban sprawl. There are 100 different ways to design a city, but there's only two types that have been tested by the thousands, and those are these two types. The traditional neighborhood is defined by being compact, by being walkable, by being diverse. It's almost always a 5-minute walk from edge to center across cultures and through time. It is, as you can see in this image, giving you places where you can work and worship and shop and live and recreate. Most of your daily needs are in that neighborhood. And then it's walkable because there's so many streets that each street can be small. So the alternative of sprawl is clearly named after the fact that it's not compact. Often there's only one use in large areas, just like you see here, often one house repeated in large areas. And then, of course, because so few of the streets actually connect to anything, those few that do quickly become overburdened. And see how these houses have turned their back to these streets? Because they're noxious and you wouldn't let your kid out on them. So you have the phenomenon of the cul-de-sac kid and the chauffeur parent, where the child has no independence beyond the cul-de-sac. So the famous New Urban list of these single-use zones that we've created, places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop, supersized civic institutions where parking lots are bigger than the buildings and no child has ever or will ever walk to this school, supersized public facilities like playgrounds, where for the pride of the Parks Board or the school board, or for some other efficiency-based reason, we consolidate and therefore we spread further apart from each other these facilities. So yes, Weston is very proud of its 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds and 10 tennis courts. But this street tells you why we have the soccer mom in America, because no mom would let her kid or dad on that street. And then the part that everyone forgot to count. So if you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then our highway system, which was created for commerce and for pleasure, for vacation driving, becomes a commuting system. So I always tell people it's a 2-part deal. You can have this. For many people, this is the American dream, but this comes with this. You can't have one without the other. Often to absurd extremes, the amount of money spent on the horizontal infrastructure in this country has become rather preposterous. We all know the experience of being in these places. This is Walter Kulash's slide, not Photoshop. Being a driver is not the funnest thing to be, and being a pedestrian can be a real hassle as well. And then, of course, the epidemiologists have been showing this slide now for about 15 years. But the idea, we've created this system in which you drive to the parking lot to take the escalator to the gym to get on the treadmill to get some exercise, is the reason why fully 1/3 of the children born after 2000 in this country are expected by the CDC to be diabetic. You know, we've created a morbid society by essentially making illegal the useful walk. Here's the 2 models. We've been showing these diagrams for, 30 years now? Just to make the point, it's the same stuff, but it's the scale of the stuff, and it's whether there's a network of streets as opposed to a branching dendritic collector street system, where if you have one car fire on this collector road, the entire system shuts down. And this gives you options and choices and is actually much more efficient. Even though this was invented, by cows, perhaps. This was invented before anyone was thinking about cars. And this is the system that was designed for cars, that serves cars so poorly. So when you're talking about an existing city, like Buffalo, you ask a different question, which is, if the walk has to be useful, then what is the balance of uses in your downtown? And what use is typically missing or underrepresented? And if you look at the jobs housing balance in a city like Buffalo, for sure, and most of the places I work, not the San Franciscos or the Bostons or the New Yorks, but the typical American cities, then it is housing that is vastly underrepresented in the downtown. And if you bring housing back, you start to get the other stuff back that used to be there that's not doing so well right now. You know, the shops that Jane Jacobs talked about, the restaurants that couldn't thrive on only a lunch trade, the gyms that couldn't thrive on only a lunch trade start coming back to life. And then eventually, the last thing to arrive is the schools. Because then you have to be a city like San Francisco or Washington, where pioneers moved in 10 years ago, 15 years ago, without a thought about having children. Then they had them. Then they got upset. And then eventually the schools started to get pretty good again. So a separate question, what use is underpriced and overrepresented in most American downtowns? And we know that that is parking. And here's where I give you my 5-minute Don Shoup discussion. Since Don Shoup is not here, I've been deputized to do this in 5 minutes. He wrote an amazing book, The High Cost of Free Parking. He writes wonderfully. It's very entertaining. It's a great read. Unfortunately, it's like 800 pages and 3.5 pounds, and it looks like a textbook. But I had jury duty, so I read his book. And I learned a lot, and I turned it into a chapter in my book with his blessing and his edit. And essentially what Don Shoup has done, which is what no one's done in, parking is the single greatest land use in American cities. And there's never been any theory until Don about how to make it work for the benefit of American cities. There's been plenty of theory about how to have enough of it, but that was trying to find the right answer to the wrong question. If the question is how to have parking benefit your city, then there's 3 answers to that, and it forms a 3-legged stool, which is Don Shoup's advice to us. The first leg of the stool is essentially to get rid of your on-site parking requirement, which creates fiascos like this gutted opera house in Detroit. That the on-site parking requirement is the single greatest killer of walkability and of vitality in American cities. It causes bad things to happen, like historical buildings being torn down, but mostly it causes good things to not happen. Because he cites the example of a furniture store that dies, and then someone wants to turn it into a music shop. But a music shop parks 3 times as many cars per visitor, per square foot, in the rule books as a furniture store. So they have to find 3 times as much parking, which they don't have. There's no place to put it, except structuring it at $25,000 a space, so it never happens. Now, is he saying get rid of the on-site parking requirement? Not necessarily. Unless you have great transit, you might want to keep your parking requirement, but consolidate it. Treat it as a civic resource. Have in lieu funds where instead of building parking, developers contribute to a fund that creates parking lots, parking structures that the city builds that become pedestrian anchors in the downtown. And that's a tool for making walkable downtowns. But the on-site parking requirement itself is the biggest thing to get rid of. Second, and this is what Shoup's best known for, is to price your parking properly. To actually treat parking as what it is, which is a good with a value, and that value is based on the demand, and the demand is the congestion. So it's congestion pricing, which we've heard about as appropriate to apply to everything if you want a market to operate efficiently. But of course, we set arbitrary parking prices. We have meters that shut off at 7 p.m., even in restaurant districts that are only busy after 7 p.m. We have meters off on Sunday in places which are thronged with shoppers on Sunday. And there's this perception that free parking is a right. But in fact, the parking meter, the merchants forget that the parking meter was invented by merchants to serve merchants to make them more money. And that when you charge the right amount for parking, you get the occasional vacancy, the 1 space per curb face, the 15% vacancy that allows Daddy Warbucks to pull in front of the furrier and make that purchase. And in city after city, where the merchants have fought charging the right price, the demand-based price for parking, and they've lost, the next day they turned around and thanked Don Shoup for beating them because their revenues skyrocketed almost immediately when they got the churn on the curb, and frankly, their own employees stopped parking in front of their stores. So this is a parking plan that just shows how the price changes in this downtown based upon the relative demand. But the merchants fight it, and in order to win them over, but also for other good reasons, you do like what they did in Pasadena, which is to have a parking benefits district. It says, your meter money makes a difference in old Pasadena, and here it made a difference because it allowed the merchants to approve a $1 an hour boost in the price of parking. Every dollar raised through that boost went to the streets, the sidewalks, the trees, the storefronts, the rear alleys of Pasadena that now look like this. And Pasadena has just skyrocketed since it started charging the right price for parking. And Westwood, which faced the same challenge at the same time and better demographics, decided at the same time to make its parking free and has declined ever since. Very clear lesson. That's Don Shoup in a nutshell, but you should still buy his book. So another question, what in your downtown is valuable and being wasted? This is a little more sophisticated. This is not in the Shoup book. It's something I learned from doing projects in Lowell, Massachusetts. The answer here is also parking. In this case, Lowell, like many American cities, had a lot of empty, in the case of Lowell, millions of square feet of empty industrial lofts that they were trying to convince developers to put market rate housing in. But the developers couldn't bring the housing in at a reasonable market rate because they had to pay 20 to 30% extra in the cost of construction to provide something that the banks were demanding. What were the banks demanding? Parking. And so the city of Lowell, led by Adam Bakke and some other really sharp folks, said, hey, we've got 5 urban parking garages that are largely empty at night, that are partly empty during the day. We'll write you a letter that you can bring to your lenders that says these are assigned to your building and you no longer have to build your parking. And these buildings are now full of apartments now. And a number of cities are doing this, none at this scale that I'm aware of. But I just finished a walkability study for downtown West Palm Beach, and we discovered even though there was a perception that these parking garages downtown were full, they weren't. And there's enough empty spaces during the day and at night to leverage 300 units of housing surrounding this garage, to leverage 90 around this garage, to leverage 350 around this garage, another 150 here. So 890 units of housing that can be built for a 20 to 30% discount because you don't have to provide the parking. So it's a lesson that applies to Buffalo. There are, in this slide and elsewhere through the downtown, a lot of parking decks, some city-owned, some not city-owned, it doesn't really matter who owns them. The city can help cut the deal that could be put towards floating new development at a lower cost with this sort of arrangement. The other part of the use discussion is transit. And the key points I like to make about transit are that, yes, you can have a totally walkable, thoroughly walkable neighborhood without transit. But thoroughly walkable cities rely on transit because if you can't get to the different walkable places without owning a car, then you buy a car. And if you buy a car and everyone else buys a car, then the whole city kind of starts to grow around you driving your car, and it becomes a less walkable city. So transit is key to the walkable city. But it's important to state that the walkable city is also key to transit. And it's only recently, I go to transit conventions. It's only been recently, and I'd say largely due to the impact of the new urbanists, that transit providers have started to talk not just about density around rail stops, but around walkability around rail stops, acknowledging that every transit trip begins and ends with a walk. And if you don't have walkability at both ends of the line, you won't get a huge ridership. And if you don't have walkability at one end of the line, you won't get much of a ridership at all. And so it's really important not just to have density rules around transit stops, but to have neighborhood design rules, form-based codes, and all the things that we're going to be talking about today. Now moving on to the second category, the safe walk. The safe walk is the biggest category. It used to refer to crime. Now it refers almost entirely to feeling that you have a good shot of not being killed by an automobile. Most of the safety issues in our cities are car-related, not crime-related, in terms of creating pedestrian districts within our cities. There's about 100 different moving parts that add up to the safety of the walk. The first is block size. This is Portland, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. You can see the measure at the bottom of the screen in these images. This is Salt Lake City, famously unwalkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Side by side, it's like two entirely different types of city. When you have a 200-foot block city, you can have mostly a 2-lane city. And most of Portland is 2 lanes. But when you have a 600-foot block city, it's a 6-lane city. And in Salt Lake City, you may remember at some of the intersections, they give out these orange flags to hold as you cross the street, because that's what you need when your typical downtown street has to be a highway, because there's so much development between it and the next street that you have this large amount of travel occurring. Here's the study, 24 different California cities. You can see that they're ranked by block size, or they're ranked by safer cities and less safe cities. When you double the block size, the number of fatal crashes not on highways almost quadruples. So there's a clear, hey, that's not funny. So there's a clear inverse relationship between block size and car crashes. Here in Buffalo, we're not doing so badly. The blocks are not much more than 200 feet. Here's Buffalo next to Portland. But of course, they're much longer than the Portland blocks. So they're, you know, as American cities go, it's still pretty good. What hurts is the super blocking. And, you know, there's some question, is it really a super block if it's got a pedestrian path? I'm having trouble reaching the slide in the right place. But if it has a pedestrian street down the middle, it's kind of a super block, it's kind of not. In terms of handling car traffic, it certainly is a super block. And when you push cars onto fewer and fewer streets, those streets have to become bigger, or let's say they tend to become bigger in American cities. So the bigger your blocks are, and when you do super block a block, you tend to end up with too fat streets in the surrounding area. And that's what happens here. And the principal lesson is, first of all, that Buffalo has pretty good bones, right? I mean, look at that. You've got a good basis from which to grow as a walkable city. You're not impeded, as so many cities are, by having blocks that are too big. The next lesson, though, is just not to do any more super blocking. And I'm sure, you know, this is probably the least walkable part of the downtown, but this tendency from the 60s and 70s, not only to rotate the grid, this must be like where the sun rises on the Stonehenge day. I don't know what this is facing, but you know, the idea of eliminating the street network, and of course, as Jennifer Kiesmat showed us, reintroducing streets and blocks to these projects is how we make them more walkable. Then there's just the number of lanes, particularly when I'm addressing a non-designer audience, an audience in a city who I'm just visiting once to leave as much behind as I can. I never neglect to have the induced demand discussion, because induced demand is the great black hole in traffic planning in America. It's the misunderstanding that underlies so many of the errors that are made in America's cities. And induced demand applies both to highways and to city streets. And what induced demand tells us, as I learned from Rick Chelman and Walter Kulash about 25 years ago, is that this is what people think happens when you widen a road. You anticipate a certain amount of growth, you widen the road, and it absorbs that growth. But there's a whole bunch of, in congested systems, only in congested systems, there's a whole bunch of latent trips that are ready to happen when they become easier to make. People make the choice to commute more at rush hour. They make the choice to live further from their job. They just choose to drive because that disincentive of traffic, which is the only major disincentive for most drivers, goes away. And so we widen the street again and we get more congestion again. And the key phrase here is that in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. So eliminating that congestion invites more drivers. Today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. And when I first read this, I took a skip in the air and then I said, wait a minute, who are these engineers and may I please meet some of them? Of course, I'd met many of them at the CNU, but most cities in which I had worked, until recently, thankfully it's starting to change, but most cities in which I had worked, they might have told you they understood induced demand, but they were making decisions every day as if they didn't understand induced demand. Principally because their citizens didn't and don't understand induced demand. And the typical citizen thinks that you can cure congestion with more lanes, but you can't cure congestion with more lanes. So the engineers say, oh, we need that extra lane because the traffic is coming, and you build the lane and the traffic comes, and they say, see, I told you so, when it's the lane that's created the traffic. This is the report that was presented at the Paris School of Economics. I have no idea what this means, but this I do understand. And what this relates is that upon adding a new lane or a new road, immediately new congestion takes up 40% roughly of the capacity, and then within 4 years, it's just as congested as it was before. So the question isn't, in congested systems, the question isn't, do you want congestion or not? It's how many lanes of congestion do you want? Metro areas that invested heavily in road capacity expansion fared no better in easing congestion than metro areas that did not. Trends in congestion showed that areas that exhibited greater growth in lane capacity spent roughly $22 billion more on road construction than those that didn't, yet ended up with slightly higher congestion costs per person, wasted fuel, and travel delay. And then there's the opposite experience, which applies very much to Buffalo, as John Norquist has told us, of reduced demand. What happens when you remove a viaduct? This is the Embarcadero Freeway in California. It and the Central Freeway, both in San Francisco, were damaged by the Loma Prieta earthquake. They had to come down. They were replaced by beautiful surface boulevards that handle trolleys like this one. And in fact, this trolley and its kin handle more people per day than this viaduct did per day. But they're just not in cars. And everyone predicted Carmageddon. We're going to have gridlock. And any plan that I've seen that reduces capacity is met with these shouts of fear of Carmageddon. And of course, what happens is there is no Carmageddon because people just simply, easily, smoothly, one at a time, adjust their behavior, and you end up with a system that functions just as well with 3 times the real estate value. When you turn this into this, all of these buildings and sites became 3 times as valuable for miles through San Francisco. Imagine what that did to the tax base of San Francisco and for the folks who had to pay for that road and found it paid for very quickly with increased tax revenue. So when you look at Buffalo, there's things like the interstate that, frankly, they're examples of how you can bring these down to grade and turn them into boulevards. But it's a lot harder. It's a much tougher argument to make. It's an argument we tried to make in Seattle. We lost. Now Big Bertha, you may know, is stuck under Seattle, trying to dig the tunnel to replace the interstate in Seattle. But what's very easy to argue is this: the spurs that come into your downtown, the Buffalo Skyway, the Kensington Expressway, the streets that come into your downtown and for some reason don't land when they should land, but speed through the city, reaming it out, sundering real estate value, making these properties next to it really worthless for any type of walkable development, which we know is more valuable development. Here too, the Skyway, just thrusting through the downtown, and very clear candidates for highway removal and replacement with boulevards. So after arguing about reduced demand in cities, and certainly after arguing about induced demand in cities, I try and let that sink in a little bit, and then I just move on. Because as important a discussion as it is, it's a really hard argument to win. And the fact is that most cities in which I work, and certainly Buffalo is a case, you just have a lot of streets that frankly are oversized, aren't burdened by traffic that in any way relates to the size of the streets. And rather than fighting battles about narrowing streets that are congested, we can fight much more winnable battles about narrowing streets that aren't congested. That was certainly the case in Oklahoma City when Prevention Magazine came out with an article naming Oklahoma City the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. And the mayor, who had been to a mayor's institute, came running and said, "This is horrible. How can we be the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country? We need a walkability study." And I did one of my first walkability studies, and what I discovered, and strangely no one else was talking about, were these traffic counts in the downtown grid. 4,000 cars a day, 3,000 cars a day, 5,000 cars a day, 6,000 cars a day. And we know, any engineer, old school or new school, will tell you that a 2-lane road handles 10,000 cars per day. So why were these streets designated as arterials in the brand new city plan and designated to be 4, 5, 6 lanes? 4 lanes or more, 10,000 cars, 8,000 cars, 5,000 cars. There was this total disconnect between the size of the streets and the amount of traffic that they were handling. So this 6-laner was only carrying 8,000 cars per day. They told me we had our own Robert Moses here in Oklahoma City. Pave it first, ask questions later. If you were a city councilor and you didn't support his road widenings, you wouldn't get the trash collected in your neighborhood. So the streets got wider and wider, and luckily, the city was building a new 50-story tower. The city, Devon Energy, was building a 50-story tower in the heart of the downtown. There's a lot of mineral wealth, the extraction economy in Oklahoma City, and that tower was going to be generating close to $200 million in tax increment. And they said, what can we spend that tax increment on? Says, well, we want to be more walkable. Let's rebuild, not restripe. And almost everything I'm going to talk about today is restriping. But they said, let's rebuild our entire 50-block downtown grid from building face to building face. It was my job to basically do the curb to curb. So taking a system of half one-way streets with very limited curb parking, with no bike infrastructure at all, doubling the amount of curb parking, which of course the merchants love, and creating a bike network in that system, turning a lot of parallel parking into angle parking, just bringing it back where it was missing, taking streets like this, the 4-laner with very few trips on it, making it a 2-laner. The project is now about 2/3 complete. If you go to Oklahoma City now and you have never been to Oklahoma City, you may not be all that impressed. But if you know what it was like before, you'll be blown away. Typical 5-laner, which was a key arterial, so we kept it at 5 lanes, but we limited the center turn lane, and the lanes were so wide that we could fit in bike lane as well on both sides. So here's an easy win, particularly for Buffalo. The classic American 4-to-3 road diet. These are wonderful, as you'll see, because they're a win-win-win proposal. These streets are inefficient and they're dangerous. They're inefficient and dangerous because the fast lane is also the turning lane. And when you turn here, this car stops, but this car doesn't, and you get T-boned. So what can you do? Well, if you create a center turn lane that's shared, you actually end up with an extra 10 to 12 feet of road to use for other things like bike paths, and you create a much more safe condition. This doesn't surprise anyone that the number of injury accidents when you make these conversions drops precipitously, but everyone is surprised by this chart, compiled by AECOM, of 17 different road diets around North America. And if you add up the number of trips before and the number of trips after, there is no reduction. In fact, a very slight increase in the number of cars being handled by this 3-lane as opposed to 4-lane road. So there's no reduction in capacity, total reduction in safety, and an amazing introduction then of either parallel parking or bike lanes or something else that you can use up the extra space with. And you've got, now, here, I couldn't count them all. Most cities I go to that are, older cities have some 4-laners, but almost all of your diagonals here in Buffalo are 4-laners. Niagara, Delaware, Elm, Broadway, William, not Elm, Broadway and William. And they look like this, and this is the perfect, you're a collection of before photos for the road diet. And I'll wait for the after photos. But there's no reason why these couldn't all be converted tomorrow for just the cost of paint. And you'd have a downtown bike network, and you'd have a much safer city and a city that handled just as many cars. Right? Just a ton of them. Then there's one-way streets. One-way streets don't feel safe to pedestrians. You have the sheer mass of vehicles, this momentum of all these lanes of vehicles going the same way. You have no opposing traffic, which slows cars down. And most importantly, you have the temptation to jockey from lane to lane, which of course goes away when you don't have that other lane. And of course, whatever lane you're in, the other lane is faster, right? As a driver, your frame of reference changes from being behind the car in front of you and looking around and looking for trouble or interest to just trying to get through the street as fast as you can. At least if you're me, that's what you do. So there's also the business stories. And the biggest, strongest arguments for the two-waying of streets that were once two-way that are now one-way is the business impacts of the one-way system. This is Vancouver, Washington. It was struggling. They tried a lot of different things to bring back the main street. I like to say the 6 B's of the 80s, the bricks, the berms, the banners, the bollards, the bandstands, and the balloons. And nothing was working. And then they convinced the leadership to make it a two-way street. And almost immediately, revenues to businesses doubled. This is the article that made it famous in Governing Magazine. Alan Ehrenholt, a really smart journalist, talks about the story there. Christian Sotil in Savannah did this study. It's not yet published, but it's in my book, of East Broad Street in Savannah. Not that many of these studies have been done, but whenever they've been done, they look like this. A two-way street was converted to one-way in 1969. Very quickly, 64% of the businesses on that street went off the tax rolls. They disappeared. In 1990, it was reverted back to two-way, and almost immediately, 50% new businesses arrived. So there's a strong business reason. And we can get into all the theory behind it. I don't really have time, but the data is very clear about that it does happen. So the typical city I work in is not a Oklahoma City, which has a lot of money to spend, but a Cedar Rapids, which doesn't have any extra money to spend. They have their annual operating budgets for repaving, and that's about all they've got. And you look at a downtown like this one, which was all four-lane, half one-way, and you say, what can we do for the cost of paint and signals? Wonderful grid. The car counts in most of the cities that I work in, like this one, farm boom, then farm bust. Car counts are all below 5,000 cars per day. And so you restripe, and you save enough money restriping to buy beer afterwards. And you take, a little hard to see, but what you're seeing here is a bunch of streets that are all four-lane and half one-way. And now they're going to become, it's already started, all two-way and all two-lane. And what does that get you? It gets you 60% more curb parking, which helps the businesses. A lot of parallel parking being converted to angle parking. Some of it rear end, hopefully a lot of it rear end. And it takes a limited bicycle network and it makes a much more robust bicycle network for the cost of paint and signals. One other thing, when you convert a four-lane intersection into a two-lane intersection, you probably don't need the signal anymore. Each one of those signals costs about 150 grand to update, and they all need to be updated. We're eliminating 11 of the 17 signals in downtown Cedar Rapids, and that's going to pay for the restriping over time. The four-way stop sign, I like to say, is the new roundabout. In fact, it's better for shopping, it's better for walking, it's much better for biking than the roundabout. Roundabouts are great in certain places. There are definitely places in every city where they make a lot of sense. But in downtown walking, pedestrian environments, biking environments, the four-way stop is a dream. Everyone's looking at everyone else, you're making eye contact, pedestrians and cars, the bikes just blow through, it's great for them, right? Four-way stops are pretty ideal. So here you have a lot of one-ways in downtown Buffalo, and I'm sure there's a conversation already, because there already is, and people are smart everywhere now. There's a conversation already here about reverting them. You have, Oak and Elm, all the streets that used to have trees that they were named after are one-way, I'm not kidding, are one-way streets. And they're not easily, but they're clearly revertible. For example, people will say, oh, we can't revert it here because there's a fork, right? And they're splitting around this green. Well, then you revert it here or here. You just don't revert it there. Plenty of projects like that have been accomplished. Hundreds around the US. Then there's the width of the lanes themselves, the classic photo. I don't remember if it's Andres or Jim Kunstler who says, the typical road to the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to witness the curvature of the earth. But the fact that the standards have changed, this is a subdivision from the 60s, this is a subdivision from the 80s. Same height, same size houses. Look what happened to the streets. The standards just crept and crept and crept, such that in my old neighborhood of South Beach, when Espanola Way wasn't draining properly and they had to rebuild it for drainage, the new standard kicks in. We lost half our sidewalk and all our street trees because of this ridiculous new standard when the old street was working perfectly well. People go faster on wider lanes. We know this, the traffic engineers admit it. At the same time as arguing that 12 feet is safer than 10 feet, most DOTs will tell you that a 12-foot lane is a high-speed lane and a 10-foot lane is a low-speed lane. So how's that work? Increased lane widths are responsible for approximately 900 additional traffic fatalities per year, according to one study. Citizens know this. In places like Birmingham, Michigan, they fight and succeed in narrowing local streets. Portland, a success story in so many ways, even instituted its own Skinny Streets program. And of course, there are handfuls of new urbanist projects, like Vince Graham's project of ION near Charleston, designed by DPZ and Dover Cole, where every time, and you know this, you have to fight, and you finally get the 22-foot street handling traffic in both directions, a residential neighborhood, low density, not a collector, but it's a neighborhood street. 12-foot clear is all you need, according to the Ashto Green Book, to handle traffic in both directions. And Vince shows this slide at conferences, and he says, there's a famous philosopher who once said, broad is the road that leads to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life. And this plays very well in the South. The ITE, working with the CNU, has created this recommended practice, right? It's a recommended practice of the ITE. It's been adopted by the American Highway Administration, the National Highway Administration, US HWA, as an approved practice. And it says what most DOTs won't let us do, which is 10-foot travel lanes in cities, okay, 11 if there's a bus, 8-foot parking lanes, which I believe is too wide a measure, but I can live with an 8-foot lane. Here's an SUV in a 6-foot bike lane. Gives new meaning to the term Lexus lanes. But the fact is, cars are 6 feet wide, so I think a 7-foot lane is perfectly adequate, but we can live with 8 if the driving lanes are narrow enough. Here's a typical street in downtown Buffalo, and what you see are lanes that are 12 feet wide and more. And what I find in a lot of cities are 50-foot four-laners that can easily be converted to four-laners plus a protected bike lane if you make the lanes 10 feet wide rather than 12 feet wide. So obviously, where possible, we want to limit the number of lanes. Where the number of car trips suggests it, it's very easy to reduce the number of lanes, introduce parallel parking, introduce bike lanes too. But very often, they won't let you limit the number of lanes, and they'll tell you the parallel parking will gum up traffic. So the best solution is to narrow the lanes to the 10-foot width, and then use the 10 feet that you gain to put in a two-way buffered bike lane, protected with a low curb, if possible, on one side of the street. Biking is the biggest, you all know this, the biggest planning revolution currently underway in only some American cities. And Portland led the way with $60 million invested over about 30 years, and they went from biking just the same as the rest of America to biking 15 times as much as the rest of America. Tom Brennan from Nelson Nygaard, I asked him to send me some pictures of the Portland bike commute, and he sent me these, and I said, is this bike to work day? He said, no, it's Tuesday in Portland. But other cities like Chicago, with these wonderful protected bike lanes, these lanes mint cyclists. When you create the lane that's protected beyond the buffer of parked cars, like at Prospect Park West in New York City, where, of course, the number of injuries to all users dropped precipitously, the amount of speeding dropped by about 50%, and interestingly, the number of car trips, the throughput of the road did not drop at all for some strange reason when 4 lanes became 3 and the bike lanes were introduced. Even traditionally automotive cities like Long Beach, California, and by the way, TED moved from Long Beach to Vancouver this year. You may be aware of the TED Talks, in part because they want to be in a walkable city, and Long Beach isn't there yet, the way Vancouver is there. But by introducing bike lanes, they create a bicycling population. And so if you believe, like Pasadena does, I think this is actually an LA-wide campaign, that every lane is a bike lane, then no lane is a bike lane. This is the old vehicular cycling motto. It's just not true. And that's why, this is the only cyclist that I met when I was in Pasadena, because it's the infrastructure that creates the cycling culture. So I looked at the bike map of Buffalo, and I saw this. This is your downtown. And I said, wow, this is amazing. Look at all these different bike facilities, the red, the green, the yellow. And then I read that red means extreme caution, experienced bicyclists only. Yellow means caution advised. And actually, the mixed-use trails just aren't, there aren't any. Now, I know that I heard, yesterday that you're introducing dozens and maybe hundreds of miles of bike lanes in the future, and that's fantastic. My biggest advice would be to focus on this area first, because this is where you're going to get the biggest bicycling population first. And I don't know what your plans are for downtown, but it's the place to start with your bike facilities. And then this map, which I have to show in Buffalo, this chart. The gray is the average summer temperatures, the green is the average winter temperatures, and this is the spikes that bear no relationship whatsoever to those temperatures is the cycling population. Because cycling population is impacted by temperature, is impacted by topography, but it's principally a function of infrastructure. And I was chastised yesterday for not pointing out Minneapolis right here. Amazing. You know, in Buffalo and Minneapolis, your weather isn't all that different. Yours is better here. Parallel parking is a barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. It's often essential. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale, parked on one side of the street, parking not allowed on the other side of the street. This is happy hour on the park side of the street. This is sad hour on the unparked side of the street. And this shop is now out of business. People don't want to be sitting next to cars moving 60 feet per second enjoying a beer. Obviously, a lot of your streets might have meters, but a lot of the meters, you know, there are times a day, I believe, when you can't park on them. And striping the parking lanes, of course, causes the drivers to slow down as well. And then the other part of this picture is the street trees. Street trees make cars drive slower. They make streets safer. Departments of Transportation fought them for many years as FHOs, fixed hazardous objects, with the belief that you needed that recovery zone when you ran off the road, also known as the sidewalk, to correct your course. But the latest studies show that there are fewer accidents on streets that have street trees and other vertical objects next to them than on other segments of the same streets that don't have those vertical objects, because they slow the cars down, sometimes dramatically. But better that this fellow hit this tree than a pedestrian. And of course, I'm willing to bet most of these streets had street trees. But in the name of becoming a more successful city by somehow allowing people to desert it more quickly, you've removed a lot of street trees from your streets as you widen them. All the little details, the curvature of radius of the corner, 1 foot versus 40 feet, generating these curves, determine whether a car has to slow down or can just swoop around the corner when they get to it, and determine how much pavement you have to cross when you're crossing the street. And I love this image because it's objective journalism. It's from the Las Vegas Sun. It says, "Some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians." This is the failing addition to the Strip in Las Vegas. And the point is that whenever the vocabulary of the streetscape communicates driving and not walking, then it's not going to attract pedestrians. So, finally, another Andres slide. You know, we have to not let the specialists rule the design of the city. Because yes, this street will be bone dry within 30 seconds of the 100-year flood, but this woman has to climb this curb every day. And then signals. Walkable cities do not have push-button signals. They have short cycles. They have push buttons in a few places across highways and other super broad expanses. But the San Franciscos, the Bostons, the New Yorks, Washingtons, they don't have push buttons. And if you are a walkable city, you won't either in most places. Pedestrian streets are very safe. Unfortunately, they have a 95% failure rate. You know, 200 streets were pedestrianized in the 60s and 70s, and all but 30 are now reverted back to traffic. I understand the one here is being reverted back to traffic, and that's great. It's unfortunate that they were pedestrianized so expensively. I'm not against experimenting with the pedestrianizing of retail zones, of shopping districts, but you should do it with trees and buckets and lawn chairs, and don't spend $1 on it until you see that the shops are doing better and not worse. Because most cities are not New York. You know, most places are not Times Square, where the shops don't depend at all upon people driving, right? So this experience hit hard all over the US. Then we're going to speed through the final two categories, the comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk deals with the fact that all animals, not just humans, all animals simultaneously seek both prospect and refuge. We want to see our prey and our predators, and we want to know that our flanks are covered from attack, which is why we crave areas with good edges, like this one happens to be in Split in Croatia. But a plaza is only as good as its edges. What's the proper ratio? It could be 1-to-1, the Renaissance ideal, or 3-to-1. Beyond 6-to-1, you lose your sense of spatial definition, and the space becomes sociofugal. You flee it. So 6-to-1 in Salzburg, pretty damn good. What's the opposite of Salzburg? Houston. And I showed this in Austin a couple weeks ago, and they said, that's not fair. That's an old picture of Houston. So I showed a new picture of Houston. But the point is that the surface parking lot is the principal villain in this discussion. And of course, in your key corridors, there are surface parking lots scattered throughout. It's important to identify those key corridors and to prioritize those parking lots for development in those locations. Then finally, the interesting walk. 1-to-1 is all well and good, but if, as in Grand Rapids, very walkable city, Grand Rapids, but this is the street that connects the two best hotels in town, and if one side of the street is a exposed parking deck and the other side is a hotel conference facility apparently designed in admiration for that exposed parking deck, then you don't get a lot of pedestrians. So, keeping it active. Joe Riley taught us it only takes 25 feet of building to hide 250 feet of garage, and a lot of cities have these rules in place. I call this the Chia Pet Garage. It's in South Beach. Activating the first floor. But these rules don't belong everywhere. These rules belong in the places where walkability is possible. And a lot of cities have applied these rules indiscriminately. You can be much more effective by explaining where they go and where they don't go. So you, of course, like every city, you have these exposed decks. And there's not too much to be done about them, but perhaps they tell you which streets, if one side is a exposed parking deck and the other side is what appears to be a switching station, this won't be in your primary network of walkability. This is a street that you're not going to prioritize for pedestrian improvements. And I love to end with this project in Columbus, Ohio. This is the convention center area, great sports facilities over here. The Short North neighborhood, ethnic, was struggling. Great restaurants, shops, but no one was walking across the bridge because this was the bridge. But when the state had to rebuild the decrepit bridge, the city gave them an extra $1.9 million. They built a bridge that was 100 feet wider, gave the extra space to a developer who built this Ponte Vecchio, right? And now this is the connection between the two neighborhoods. And according to the reports, not the planning reports, the newspaper reports, this bridge is the reason why the Short North is the hottest neighborhood right now in Columbus, Ohio. It really brought it back. So I don't care if it's a highway or just 3 Jiffy Lubes, right? Whenever you have something that's separating decent walkability from decent walkability, and they're almost touching, that's a place to start. Which gets us to our final point, which is that, this is a lot. How do we do all these things? It's expensive, and you got to do them all. And the answer is urban triage, another Dwani term. And what urban triage says is that you pick your winners, and that, in fact, it's a bad strategy to not select your winners. And that as a city, you really have control in the short term over just this, the safe walk. You can fix the street in short order. It's tougher to fix the reason to walk, the comfortable walk, and the interesting walk, because that's the outcome of developers, principally. Now you can influence it and fix it in the long term with codes, form-based codes, active facade codes, with investment, with tax increment financing, and you should do these things. But in the short term, the way to create the sort of excellent places that hit on all 4 of these cylinders is to apply the safety changes first to those places that are already just about to be walkable, but they're not yet safe. So in a typical walkability study, what you do is, and this is Fort Lauderdale, is a frontage assessment, rating the streets block by block by block, or actually 100 feet by 100 feet, in terms of whether they're useful, comfortable, and interesting. I'm being told my time is up, and I am finishing up. Thank you. So you rate them, and the rating system looks like this, from an A to an F. And a pattern emerges of an almost walkable loop. Everything else is pretty bad. Oh, but let's pay attention to anchors and paths, and let's pay attention to equity. All the people who land in downtown Fort Lauderdale without a car land in this bus station. And of course, they should be able to get to the walkable area. So that's an anchor and a path and an equity discussion. Then there's a whole neighborhood growing up here of tons of, thousands of units of housing, and they should be able to get north-south. So you adjust things a little bit, and that drawing becomes this drawing. And I'm not going to deal with the secondary network of walkability, which is the darker green, but you'll see the primary network of walkability pretty much lines up with where you've already got the comfortable, the useful, and the interesting walk, and you just need to make it safe. So you fix the streets first by making them safer. You take this street, you bring the parking back, you acknowledge that the lanes are 15 feet wide, so you can stick in 2 5-foot bike lanes, right? And then you fix the street walls, because actually there's a difference between this drawing and the frontage quality drawing, and the difference are these buildings. You need these 10 red buildings to perfect the street walls in the primary network of walkability. So you circle the wagons, the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector. We all agree as a community in Fort Lauderdale, these are the 10 most important sites for developing. And once you know it, this one happens to sit right next to a municipal parking garage that is empty from 5:05 every night until 7:55 every morning, and available to float development at a lower cost. And so you move forward with that. So that's just one example of the kind of work that arises from a focus on the general theory of walkability as a means for improving a city. And when I go to a city, I do very few, I might do one master plan type effort a year, but mostly what I do are these walkability studies. And I say to the city, my goal is to figure out how, in the shortest amount of time, spending the least amount of money, we can witness the greatest increase in the number of people walking and biking in your downtown. And then we just point everything towards that goal. So I'll be signing books over there. Here's the other 2 books that I encourage you to read. And the third book I encourage you to buy today, that I had nothing to do with, but is an essential tool in this quest, is Victor Dover and John Massingale's book on street design that's also for sale over there. Here's my Twitter handle. I encourage you to follow me because it will make me feel better about myself if you follow me. And I'm really grateful that you came, and I thank you for your attention. And this meeting is adjourned.